What's up, folks? Valorant here. As you well know, Dragonflight is a little over 2 weeks away from launch, so I wanted to talk a bit about my thoughts on Frost Mage Talent Tree, specifically from a Mythic Plus perspective. We'll be doing another video soon with my opinions on raid talents, but this is going to be focused entirely on Mythic Plus. First, we are still in beta, so of course any of this can change before Dragonflight releases, and honestly, even after Dragonflight releases. So, if there's any major changes from here on out, I'll either update the video or just take it down, depending on the changes. Second, I do still plan on releasing a patch 10.0 Frost Mage Mythic Plus guide. But my idea for that guide is to be a little more beginner friendly, if you will. And so in the guide, I'm probably not going to go very in depth regarding talent selection. Maybe kind of just give my recommended starter builds, perhaps one for fortified weeks and one for tyrannical weeks, for new players to just jump right in. So I wanted to do this video as sort of a companion to that. That goes in a little more in depth on how I think individual talents feel and talk about some of the choices you have with your build. So, the way I attempted to capture this was by giving each individual talent my own personal rating of green, yellow, orange, or red. Essentially, green is a mandatory talent. You will always pick this talent. Yellow is not mandatory, but it's still pretty decent, so this is where some of your personal choice might come in. Orange talents aren't completely useless, but for whatever reason, they aren't very good. And of course, red talents are the ones you should never spend a point on whatsoever. And last but not least, keep in mind that, again, I'm analyzing each of these talents from a purely Mythic Plus perspective. You might see some talents in here that are orange, and they're great in a raid build, but that's not what this video is about. And when I release my next video, you'll see what I mean. So, getting right into it. I will begin with the class tree, but I'm not going to go in too much depth here. The class tree is largely your choice of utility spells. There's definitely some mandatory talents here, but for the most part, they're all right down the middle, and you'll pick them up pretty quickly, and you'll have lots of points left. In the Mage class tree, you'll never be down to your last couple of points trying to choose between two really good talents. It'll just never happen because there's not that many really good talents. If anything, you'll be struggling to choose from the least mediocre talents just to work your way down past the gates. The first three here, Ice Block, Invis, and Overflowing Energy, I would consider all of these mandatory. Invis is a little less mandatory since you'll be taking greater Invis, but you still want to get down to alter time, so it is effectively mandatory. Now, the whole next row here is entirely situational. The fastest way through these is to take Spell Steal and Remove Curse, since they're 1 point each. But if you're doing a dungeon with nothing to Spell Steal and no curses to remove, these are completely worthless. But the other four talents here, not only do they take 2 points each, but they're all pretty bad. Winter's Protection is only useful if you need to Ice Block on cooldown, which is pretty rare. Tempest Barrier is a very small absorb shield. Incantation is really only useful for running back after wipes, and Arcane Warding is also a pretty small damage reduction. Although if I had to pick one of these, I would pick Arcane Warding, and you'll see that reflected later in the video in my sample build. So really pick your poison here. There's no great options unless you're running a dungeon with opportunities to spell steal and remove curses. As you'd probably expect, mirror images, Rune of Power, and Alter Time are mandatory. If you're not a fan of Rune of Power, it's not quite as powerful as it was in Shadowlands because we don't have AoE Icy Propulsion anymore, but it is still slightly better than Incanter's Flow. On the next tier, I'm a big fan of Quick Witted, and if you're running in a coordinated group, you will definitely want this. Master of Time is also pretty outstanding, and it opens up Blast Wave, which you're definitely going to want as well, so it's effectively mandatory. Aside from that, Cryo Freeze definitely takes pressure off your healer if you need to Ice Block. Unfortunately, Reduplication and Reabsorption is absolutely terrible. I almost considered making this one red, but it only works when you have aggro, which should be pretty rare unless your tank dies. And even then, reduced cooldown is not going to save you. So Mass Poly might actually have some use. If, let's say, someone accidentally pulls extra mobs, you could potentially Mass Poly. and allow the tank to sort of soft reset the pull. Diverted energy, again, amounts to very little effective health overall. And I say that about all three of these defensive nodes here. Tempest Barrier, Arcane Warding to a lesser extent, and Diverted Energy. They absolutely add some effective health, but it's just not much. Next up, Ice Nova, and either Shimmer or Ice Flows, depending on your preference, are very good. Ring of Frost definitely has some situational use, and Blast Wave is an outstanding oh shit button, especially once you take Volatile Detonation down here. You'll definitely want to take the two secondary stat nodes, Tome of Ronin and Tome of Antonidas, but Improved Frost Nova, Rigid Ice, and Energized Barriers are all pretty bad. So, past the final gate here, you definitely want Flow of Time, Greater Invis, and either Temporal Warp or Time Anomaly. If you're doing very low keys where bosses tend to die quickly, I'd probably take Time Anomaly. But if you can make use of a full 80 seconds of Time Warp, it's also pretty good in keys. So I'm going to skip ahead to the bottom corners here, because the rest of your choice in this tree pretty much depends whether you go Meteor or Shifting Power. And honestly, Meteor just isn't tuned very well right now. If they ended up buffing Meteor, I would feel a little differently here. But in my opinion, they're both pretty lackluster. The only reason I give a slight edge to Shifting Power here is because the cooldown reduction works even if it doesn't hit anything. So maybe there's a RP event before a boss spawns or something. You can use Shifting Power there to get your Icy Veins or your Frozen Orb back off cooldown, which makes me more likely to send my cooldowns on the trash packs right before the boss. So jumping into the Spec Tree here, and I might tackle this a little bit out of order, but bear with me. The first gate here, up to 8, is pretty easy because pretty much everything is mandatory. Piercing Cold here is a good example of a talent that's great in Raid, but only average in Mythic Plus. But to get down to Splitting Ice down here, you have to go through either Piercing Cold or Frostbite, and I just feel Frostbite is a slightly better option because it does have some synergy with Sub-Zero down here. Bone Chilling is a solid passive damage increase, so it's hard to argue with that. So you pretty much have to go through either Sub-Zero or Flash Freeze and Splintering Cold. The reason I chose Sub-Zero here is that it does work with Frostbite and adds a solid amount of damage to your Frozen Orb. So Icicles and Mastery are outstanding in Dragonflight. But the simple fact is they're much better on 1 or 2 targets. So the more targets you're AoEing in a dungeon, the more they start to fall off. Whereas Frostbite and Sub-Zero don't. But ultimately, this is kind of one of those choices that for me comes down to whether it's a Fortified or Tyrannical week. And my upcoming guide video for Mythic Plus will probably reflect that. Hailstones, on the other hand, is simply so good that even in heavy AoE, it is essentially mandatory. Hailstones is one of the best talents in this entire tree. Unfortunately, unless Glacial Spike gets a significant buff, at this time it's not tuned well enough to be viable. And of course, neither is Ray of Frost, but that shouldn't really surprise anyone by now. So, coming down the middle of the tree, we've got Lonely Winter and Ice Caller, which is essentially the old improved Blizzard. Absolutely mandatory. You may have seen some guides, at least in pre-patch, recommend taking Water Elemental here. And it can be useful in very high target situations, but unless you're doing like enormous trash pulls, Lonely Winter is the better choice here. I wouldn't say Snowstorm is outstanding here, but Wintertide is not really super useful for a Mythic Plus build. It's much better for raiding. And you have to get down to Icy Veins, which essentially makes Snowstorm the mandatory talent here. As you'd probably expect, Freezing Rain is outstanding, and so is almost all of this little central fork here at the bottom. The only exception is that by now you're starting to get a little starved for talent points. And Slick Ice is something you're really only going to use on bosses. So once again, this point ends up being kind of a fortified versus tyrannical choice for me. And as we start to explore the left side of the tree, honestly, Perpetual Winter is kind of the same deal. It's obviously very good on single target, but until you start doing higher keys, the bosses are mostly going to melt so fast you'll barely notice it. And even on tyrannical weeks, most of the damage that you deal during a key is not going to be to bosses, it's going to be to trash. And when you're starved for points, frankly, I feel like this is an easy one to drop. Although you will see at the end that my, beginner build does choose it. Frozen Touch is not something that I would choose for Mythic Plus. First of all, it's not 20% more proc rate. It's multiplicative. So in other words, if your base proc chance is 20%, Frozen Touch adds 20% of 20%, which is effectively 4% more proc rate. Not to mention, you'll rarely even cast Frostbolt in dungeons, which is the same reason I would never take Deep Shatter. Glacial Assault over here, unfortunately, it's just pretty bad. It's obvious they tried to keep our Shadowlands tier set bonus around in some form, but it's very lackluster for a 2-point talent. So I struggled with whether to give Comet Storm an orange or a red here, but hear me out. It's not that Comet Storm is bad, because in fact, Comet Storm is quite good. The problem is its position in the tree. Comet Storm is good, but you essentially have to waste 2 talent points going through either Glacial Assault or Deep Shatter to get to it. If we had more points to spend, that wouldn't be a problem, but we don't. At the end of the day, Comet Storm is good, it's just out of reach. Last but not least, if you enjoyed the Cold Front build in patch 9.2, I have some bad news for you. The only reason Cold Front was viable in 9.2 was because of 3 things that synergized very well. The Necrolord Covenant ability, the Necrolord Unity, or second legendary, and Icy Propulsion working on AoE spells like Frozen Orb. All 3 of those things are gone in Dragonflight, and Fractured Frost is not even remotely an adequate substitute. I do think that if they added Ice Lance to the stacking criteria for Cold Front, it could be a step in the right direction towards fixing it. But for now, it's essentially a dead build. As I said, I am going to be working on a 10.0 Mythic Plus guide that has my recommended starter builds, but if I had to put all this together into kind of a one-size-fits-all build, if you will, what would it look like? Well, I think it would be something like this. You can see I did choose to go through, where is it? Flash Freeze and Splintering Cold on my way down to Splitting Ice. But honestly, Sub-Zero would be totally viable as well. If anything, I'd switch these 2 points from Splintering Cold over to Sub-Zero, especially if it's a fortified week. And of course, I chose not to take Slick Ice, but that point could float easily between Perpetual Winter and Slick Ice, because both of those are really only effective on bosses. So I'm sure the question on everyone's mind is, how exactly is Frost performing on beta? Honestly, I've done several keys on the beta, and I genuinely feel like both Fire and Frost are going to be very good in keys. If you liked playing Frost Mage around patch 9.15 in Shadowlands, I got good news for you, because the optimal build for Dragonflight plays pretty much identical to how it did in 9.15, which, by the way, was when Frost enjoyed a pretty solid place in the meta. So, for what it's worth, I've been playing a Frost Mage for 18 years now, and it feels pretty good to me in Dragonflight keys. If you'd like to talk more about anything in this video, or even if you disagree with me, you'll find a link to my Discord server down below, or you can just drop a comment here on the video. I am hoping to get back on Twitch and stream Dragonflight keys over at twitch.tv/Valorant. but I will be prioritizing my YouTube channel. Up next, I'll be working on pretty much this same video from a raid perspective, so keep an eye out for that. Until then, see you next time.